Welcome to the deep dive. When we start thinking about India's tribal populations, often the image that pops up is, well, it's usually one of isolation, isn't it? Maybe from old films or books.
Right, people living completely separate lives, almost outside of time.
Exactly. But the reality, as our sources today make incredibly clear, is just so much more complex. We're talking about hundreds of millions of people, thousands of distinct groups. It's this massive, intricate tapestry.
And it's a tapestry woven with unique cultures, yes, but also sophisticated traditional ways of governing themselves, and crucially, deep, often quite painful connections to the modern world, the modern economy, the state.
That connectivity, that's really the key, isn't it?
Absolutely. Our sources today, they're really dense, but it's a necessary synthesis. We're going way beyond just simple definitions. We're digging into anthropological standards, historical classifications, some quite controversial, frankly, especially the racial ones from the colonial era.
And then connecting that to the present day.
Yes, examining the constitutional policies that define who is legally a tribe and analyzing these urgent socioeconomic problems. The cycles of debt, displacement, health crises that are the daily reality for so many communities.
Okay, so let's frame our mission for this deep dive. We really need to cut through some of the jargon, first to understand the incredible diversity here. But maybe more importantly, we need to grasp the debates, academic, legal, economic, around who actually counts as a tribe, who gets to decide.
And that question of who decides has huge implications.
Huge. And finally, we have to look squarely at this paradox of development. How does progress, like a new dam or a mine, so often end up meaning displacement, losing land, and making tribal communities more vulnerable, not less?
It's a central tension. And for you, the listener, we've tried to distill this. We'll lay out the foundational concepts, everything from those early biogenetic classifications, Risley using the nasal index, things like that.
Right, the historical context.
All the way to crucial modern legal frameworks. We'll talk about the Forest Rights Act, the PISA Act, and findings from key reports like the XAXA Committee. The goal is for you to come away with a really thorough, nuanced grasp of this vital field.
Okay, let's start where we have to. Definitions. It seems basic, but the sources show right away that defining tribe is actually really complicated.
It is, because the term has to stretch to cover such a vast range of experiences. You've got groups like the Sentinelese who are almost completely isolated, and then you have groups deeply integrated into the national economy. How does one word capture all that?
So the definition itself becomes a point of debate.
It's central, because how you define a group shapes policy. If you emphasize backwardness, policy focuses on upliftment. If you emphasize political independence, policy might lean towards autonomy.
So who are some of the key thinkers trying to pin this down?
Well, a really influential definition came from D.N. Majumdar. He saw a tribe primarily as an economic unit. He described it as a social group with a specific territory, usually endogamous marrying within the group sharing a common dialect, and maintaining social distance from castes.
Okay, territory, marriage rules, language. What was the critical economic point for him?
The key phrase was no specialization of functions. This implies a relatively simple, self-sufficient economy, lacking that complex division of labor you see in caste systems or cities.
That makes sense. It emphasizes a kind of economic self-containment. But you mentioned other perspectives focusing more on politics.
Exactly. Majumdar focused on the internal workings. But then you have someone like Lucy Mayer. For her, a tribe was fundamentally an independent political division within a larger population that shared a common culture. Her emphasis was really on self-rule, on autonomy.
So less about how they make a living, more about how they govern themselves.
Precisely. And Ralph Linton, similarly, talked about unity coming from common interests and frequent contact among groups living near each other.
So if we're trying to boil this down, it's kind of a tension between viewing tribes through the lens of economic isolation, like Majumdar, or through their history as independent political units, like Mayer.
That's a good way to put it. And in terms of how India administers this, which definition holds more sway?
Well, administratively, it tends to lean towards criteria suggesting backwardness and isolation, largely because those are the factors that trigger legal protections under the Constitution.
Right. When anthropologists tried to synthesize the general characteristics of Indian tribes, some common themes emerged pretty consistently.
Like what?
Typically, they possess a definite common topography, a shared geographical space. and a very strong sense of unity.
And that unity comes from?
Almost always. It's heavily based on kinship relations. Blood ties, clan structures, that's the real glue holding the community together.
Okay, so kinship is central. What else? Common dialect we mentioned.
Yes, and endogamous marriage practices are very common. Reliance on what's often termed primitive technology. An isolated form of living, often in forests or hills.
And socially, what's often highlighted as different from mainstream society.
Perhaps the most celebrated aspect is their tendency towards egalitarian values. Compared to the very rigid hierarchy of the caste system, traditional tribal societies often show much less stratification, sometimes greater gender equality, communal resource ownership. This idea of equality is often quite strong.
But as contact increased, surely those traditional definitions started to fray around the edges.
Absolutely. The ideal type became harder to find, so the criteria had to shift, becoming more practical, more focused on their current economic reality.
And who drove that refinement?
Scholars like T.B. Naik were important here. He argued that for a group to be considered a tribe administratively, they needed to show the least functional interdependence with the wider regional economy.
Meaning they should be largely self-sufficient or peripheral?
Exactly. He focused on two key indicators. Economic backwardness, defined by using primitive means to exploit resources like shifting cultivation, hunting, gathering, and comparative geographical isolation. These became measurable proxies for being on the margins.
And that marginal status then justifies specific state interventions or protections.
Correct. But through all these evolving definitions, one thing remained constant.
Kinship.
Kinship. As Majumdar Madana observed, it's the single strongest integrating force. Think about groups like the Santhals, who migrated huge distances, say, to work on tea plantations in Assam.
Right.
Their Santhal identity, their social rules, their connections back home, that all remain incredibly strong because of those powerful kinship bonds. It's the bedrock.
Okay, so from social structures and definitions, let's move to the sheer physical diversity. There was this period, especially in the colonial era, obsessed with classifying people based on physical features, wasn't there? Biogenetic variability.
Oh, absolutely. It was a major focus of early anthropology. They looked at observable traits, phenotypic variations like skin color, hair texture, but the core tools were these precise body measurements, anthropometry.
Like the famous nasal index.
Exactly. The nasal index, the ratio of the nose's width to its height, and the cephalic index, the ratio of the head's breadth to its length. These were thought, quite mistakenly we now know, to be stable, definitive markers of race and origin.
Why such a focus on the nose, particularly?
It fit into the racial theories of the time. Broad noses were often associated with supposedly primitive or Dravidian populations, while narrower noses were linked to Aryan or higher status groups. It was a way to quantify difference and create hierarchies that administrators like Risley could use.
So it served an administrative purpose, too.
Definitely. They also looked at genetic markers, serological things like blood group systems, and even non-serological traits like the ability to taste certain chemicals, trying to find biological confirmation for these categories.
Which brings us to Sir Herbert Hope Risley's classification, the first big scientific attempt for all of India.
Yes, Risley was a major colonial administrator, and his 1901 census work included this classification. He divided India's population into 7 types. For tribal groups, he focused on 2 main categories. Like first, the Dravidian type. He characterized them as long-headed, broad-nosed, short, with dark complexions. He put groups like the Todas of the Nilgiris and the Santhals in this category, theorizing they were the original inhabitants pushed south.
Okay, and the second tribal category, covering the Himalayas and Northeast.
That was his Mongoloid type. Distinct features: broad heads, a yellowish skin tone, relatively little body hair, and that characteristic epicanthic fold of the eyelid. Tribes like the Khasis of Meghalaya fit here, reflecting links to East Asia.
But Risley's work wasn't the last word. B.S. Guha's classification, based on the 1931 census, is often seen as more rigorous, right?
Yes. Guha was the first Indian head of the Anthropological Survey, and he really emphasized systematic anthropometric data collection across the country. His system proposed 8 main types and several subtypes. For tribal India, he refined Risley's categories, particularly focusing on 2 groups he saw as foundational: the Negrito and the Proto-Australoid.
Let's take the Negrito first, often described as the absolute earliest inhabitants, the Autochthones.
That's the idea, defined by very short stature, dark skin, and the key trait: frizzly hair growing in tight spirals or peppercorns. Today, they're found in extreme isolation. Think of the Kadars in Kerala or the Onjays, Jarwas, and especially the Sentinelese in the Andaman Islands.
But Guha also suggested mainland groups had Negrito links.
He did, mentioning groups like the Yangaminagas based on some features, and that became and remains quite controversial.
Okay, and the other foundational group, according to Guha, the Proto-Australoid.
This is the group that constitutes the vast majority of mainland tribal populations, the Santhols, Bills, Mundas, Orions, Gons, etc. They're characterized as short to medium height, dark brown skin, long heads. Crucially, their hair is wavy or curly, not frizzly like the Negritos, and they typically have a broad, flat nose, often depressed at the root.
This distinction immediately brings us to the famous Negrito debate. Was there ever really a widespread Negrito population on the Indian mainland?
It's a classic anthropological puzzle. The arguments for it, from scholars like Hutning and Guha, pointed to sporadic finds of frizzly hair, some skeletal analysis suggesting links, even depictions in ancient cave art like Ajanta,
And the arguments against.
led by people like Risley himself and later Sarkar. They stress the almost complete lack of Negrito-type skeletal remains in major archaeological sites like Mohenjo-Daro or Harappa. If they were the first inhabitants, where are the bones?
What about genetic clues, like blood groups?
Opponents noted that the high frequency of the B blood group, often associated with Negrito populations elsewhere, is actually quite low among most Indian tribes. Eichstätt later suggested much of the debate stemmed from confusion between truly woolly hair and simply frizzy hair.
So the consensus is
That if a distinct Negrito element exists on the mainland, it's likely very localized or deeply assimilated, not a continuous ancient layer across the subcontinent. These physical classifications, while detailed, didn't provide a definitive history.
they gave us types, but not necessarily origins.
Exactly. Which is why linguistic classification often provides a clearer picture of historical connections and migrations.
Right, the work of Grierson and later Chatterjee. What are the key language families for understanding tribal India?
India's languages fall into four major families. For tribal groups, two are particularly significant: the Austric and the Sino-Tibetan.
Let's start with Austric. Small percentage-wise, but culturally important.
Very much so. The Austric family, sometimes called Nishad, is spoken by only about 1.38% of Indians. It has two main branches relevant here. The Munda branch, which includes major tribal languages like Santali, Mundari, Ho, spoken mainly in central and eastern India.
And the other branch?
The Mon Khmer branch, which includes Khasi in Meghalaya and Nicobarese in the Andaman Islands. The presence of these languages points to very ancient connections across Southeast Asia.
Okay, and the Sino-Tibetan family?
Often called Kirat, this family accounts for just under 1% of the population, around 0.857%, and covers most of the tribes in the Himalayas in the northeast, Nagas, Bodos, Mishmas, Lepchas, etc., reflecting ties north and east.
We should also mention the Dravidian family, right? While dominant in the south, it has tribal languages too.
Absolutely. Major tribal languages like Gondi, spoken by the Gons, one of the largest tribes, Ku, spoken by the Khans, and Kruruk, spoken by the Orions, belong to the Dravidian family, showing deep links across peninsular India, even in areas dominated by Indo-Aryan languages today. Language gives us a different map of connections.
So this incredible diversity, both physical and linguistic, and the sheer difficulty of pinning down definitive scientific categories, it really highlights why, post-independence, India needed a clear administrative definition.
Exactly. Science couldn't provide a neat list. The state needed a practical way to identify and provide specific protections for historically marginalized groups.
And that mechanism is the Scheduled Tribe, or ST designation?
Precisely. The term scheduled tribes itself first appears in the Constitution. Article 366, Clause 25, defines STs simply by pointing to Article 342, and Article 342 lays out the process. Yes. It says the president, after consulting with the governor of a state, can issue a public notification specifying which tribes or tribal communities, or parts of them, are considered scheduled tribes for that particular state.
That state-specific part is crucial, isn't it? A group can be ST in one state but not another?
Absolutely critical. It reflects the reality that a community's level of isolation, backwardness, and integration can vary significantly depending on the local context. And importantly, once that initial list is notified by the president.
Only Parliament can change it.
Correct. By law. It understands that this is fundamentally a political and legal status, not just an anthropological label.
Since the Constitution didn't give a checklist of traits, how did the government decide who should actually be on these state lists? What criteria emerged?
That guidance came largely from the Lower Court Committee in 1965. They recommended 5 key indicators, which have more or less become the standard administrative benchmark.
What are they?
They echo some of the anthropological ideas, but make them more policy-oriented. First, geographical isolation. Second, having a distinctive culture. Third, showing signs of primitive traits, things like reliance on older forms of agriculture or livelihood.
Okay, isolation, culture, primitive traits.
Fourth, general backwardness, usually measured socioeconomically. And fifth, shyness of contact with the wider community. These 5 points, especially backwardness and shyness, became the main justifications used for including groups on the ST lists.
But even within the large ST category, there's obviously a huge range of development and vulnerability. Some groups are far more marginalized than others.
Exactly. That realization led to another administrative layer, the particularly vulnerable tribal groups, or PVTGs.
This was recommended quite early on.
Yes, the DBAR Commission suggested a special category way back in 1962 for the most vulnerable groups. The term PVTG itself was formally adopted in 2006. Currently, there are 75 such groups identified across India.
So what elevates a group from just being an ST to being classified as a PVC? What are the extreme markers?
It's a combination of really dire circumstances. 4 main characteristics define them. 1, their livelihoods are almost totally forest-dependent, often hunting and gathering. 2, they exist at a pre-agriculture stage technologically.
Still hunter-gatherers, or very basic farming.
Right. 3, critically, they often show a stagnant or even declining population trend. And 4, they have very low literacy rates, often near 0. These groups are facing existential threats.
Can you give us some examples? We mentioned the Andaman groups.
Yes, the Angis, Jarwas, and Sentlis in the Andamans are classic examples of extreme isolation and vulnerability. On the mainland, you have groups like the Bondos in Odisha, the Birhors in Jharkhand, the Cholanikans in Kerala. The key point is that their vulnerability is so acute, declining numbers, extreme poverty, fragile ecosystems, that standard ST development programs often don't work or could even harm them. They need highly specific, sensitive support.
While we're on legal protections, we have to briefly touch on the 2 main constitutional schedules designed for tribal areas, Schedule 5 and Schedule 6. They sound similar, but operate very differently.
A really important distinction. Schedule 5 applies to areas with significant tribal populations across mainland India states like Jharkhand, Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Madhya Pradesh, etc.
And how does it work?
Here, the governor of the state has special powers and responsibilities. They report to the president on the administration of these scheduled areas. Crucially, laws passed by the state legislature don't automatically apply. The governor can modify them or decide they don't apply at all to protect tribal interests. There's also a Tribes Advisory Council. The power is mainly executive.
Okay, so Schedule 5 is about executive oversight. How is Schedule 6 different?
Schedule 6 is unique to the Northeast states like Assam, Meghalaya, Tripura, and Mizoram. It provides for much greater autonomy through the creation of autonomous district councils, ADCs.
And these councils have real power.
Yes, significant legislative, administrative, and judicial power. They can make laws on land use, forest management, inheritance customs, social practices, set up courts, manage schools, collect certain taxes. It's a framework for genuine local self-governance, far more decentralized than Schedule 5. Both schedules aim to protect tribal land and culture, but through very different mechanisms.
Okay, now we shift from the legal frameworks designed to protect to the grim reality of why they often fail. The sources consistently point to one issue as the absolute core of the problem: land alienation.
It truly is the bedrock issue. Land isn't just property for most tribal communities. It's their identity, their history, their spiritual anchor. Losing it is catastrophic.
And the scale of this loss is shocking.
It's horrifying. Some estimates suggest up to 80% of tribal lands have been lost or alienated from their original owners over time. And look at displacement. The XXA committee compiled data showing that tribal people, who are less than 9% of India's population, make up a staggering 47% of all people displaced by development projects like dams, mines, and industries.
Almost half of all displaced people are tribal. That concentration is it's a damning statistic about where the costs of development fall.
It really is. And the causes are this toxic mix. At the individual level, you have vulnerability due to ignorance of complex laws, illiteracy, and predatory moneylenders who seize land when small loans default.
But the bigger driver is systemic.
Yes. The largest driver is development-induced displacement. The massive tracts of land required for mining India's mineral wealth is largely under tribal lands. Hydroelectric projects like the Narmada dams or the historical Pong Dam you mentioned earlier, which displaced 150,000 people. Steel plants like Jamshedpur displacing 100,000. The scale is immense.
And the impact goes far beyond just losing land.
Oh, it's a complete unraveling. Immediate poverty, yes, but also profound culture shock, breakdown of social systems, loss of traditional livelihoods, leading to things like bonded labor, trafficking, and often deep resentment and unrest, which can fuel movements like left-wing extremism.
We talked about protective laws like the Forest Rights Act. Why haven't they stopped this alienation?
The laws are good on paper, but implementation is the massive hurdle. The Forest Rights Act, FRA, of 2006 is potentially revolutionary. It recognizes the rights of forest-dwelling communities, including individual rights to land they've cultivated for generations, up to 4 hectares, and community rights over forest resources.
But getting those rights recognized
Have been incredibly slow and often actively resisted by forest departments or local vested interests.
Right.
The documentation required is complex, awareness is low. Similarly, court rulings like the landmark Samatha judgment, which tried to restrict the transfer of tribal land in scheduled areas to non-tribals for mining, have faced challenges in enforcement. The economic pressures are just relentless.
And the direct consequence of losing land is almost inevitably deep poverty.
It creates a poverty trap. The official figures bear this out. XAXA reported about 43% of the ST population below the poverty line, nearly double the national average of 24%. And debt is the chain that binds them. Around 69% are estimated to be caught in the distress of indebtedness.
Can you give us concrete examples of how this debt trap works? You mentioned specific systems.
Yes, these aren't just random loans. They are often institutionalized exploitation. In parts of Maharashtra, there's the Palamod system, literally paddy field debt. Moneylenders give loans for seeds or basic survival needs, often at exorbitant interest, timed just before the agricultural season. One bad monsoon, and the farmer loses their land or becomes bonded.
And the Dadan system in Tripura.
That's particularly insidious. Creditors provide cash or goods as an advance, but the condition is that they get the right to buy the borrower's entire future harvest, usually paddy or forest produce, at a prefixed, heavily discounted rate, often 50% or less of the actual market price. The farmer is locked into selling cheap, guaranteeing they remain indebted year after year.
This isn't just economic hardship, it's a stripping away of dignity. B.D. Sharma's analysis of the levels of deprivation really captures this downward spiral.
It's a powerful framework because it shows the progression from material loss to psychological surrender. Sharma outlined 5 levels.
What's the first level?
Non-recognition of rights. Simply put, the state or the market refuses to acknowledge their traditional rights over the resources they depend on: land, forest, water. Their claim is ignored.
Level 2.
Alienation from the means of production. They physically lose control over their land, forests, tools. They become landless, resourceless.
Then comes exploitation of their labor.
Exactly. Level 3 is the denial of due entitlement of labor. Forced into wage labor, often unskilled and precarious, they're paid exploitative rates, far less than their work is worth.
Level 4 sounds like the point of no return.
It's the bartering of personal liberty. This is where debt bondage comes in. Having lost everything else, individuals or families pledge their own labor, essentially their freedom, to repay debts they can likely never clear.
And the final, devastating level.
The 5th level is psychological acceptance of destitution. This is the internalization of oppression, the loss of self-respect, the belief that this deprived state is normal, inevitable, even deserved. It makes breaking the cycle incredibly difficult because the spirit to resist is broken. It shows why solutions need to address dignity and rights, not just poverty alleviation.
That deep deprivation inevitably impacts education. The national literacy rate has improved, but tribal literacy still lags significantly, around 59% in 2011. What are the barriers?
They're deeply intertwined. Poverty is fundamental work. Children are needed for work. Education seems like a luxury. The school curriculum is often totally alien, taught in a language they don't speak at home, reflecting a culture they don't recognize. This leads to massive dropout rates.
And attitudes within the school system.
Sadly, yes. There's documented indifference, prejudice, and outright discrimination from teachers and staff in many areas. Children feel unwelcome, alienated.
The sources even mention cultural beliefs acting as barriers.
Yes, the example of the Gausia tribe in Madhya Pradesh is noted, where a traditional belief held that the gods would be angered by modern education. And we have documented cases, like Gausia children in parts of UP being made to sit separately, facing daily humiliation. It's not abstract, It's real discrimination.
So what are the policy solutions being proposed?
Reports like XAXA and Saxena consistently emphasize making education tribal-centric. That means using their mother tongue in early grades, incorporating their folklore and history into the curriculum, making it relevant.
And practical skills.
Yes, strong emphasis on job-oriented vocational training, and crucially, establishing more residential schools or ashram shalas, especially for children from remote or nomadic communities who can't access daily schooling.
Let's turn to the health and nutrition crisis. The statistics here are just stark, showing a huge gap.
They paint a picture of a real health catastrophe. The infant mortality rate, IMR, for STs is around 88 per 1,000 live births. That's about 30% higher than the national average. Under 5 mortality is 129 per 1,000 compared to 96 nationally.
What drives these poor health outcomes?
It's a combination of factors. Chronic malnutrition is rampant. High rates of communicable diseases like malaria, tuberculosis, waterborne illnesses are common due to poor sanitation and lack of access to clean water.
Lifestyle factors, too.
Yes, high consumption of local alcohol and tobacco contributes significantly. The sources mention high rates of certain cancers among Naga tribes linked directly to smoking habits, for example.
And sometimes traditional beliefs can negatively impact health.
Tragically, yes. The example of the Korwa tribe having food taboos restricting salt intake, leading to widespread iodine deficiency and goiter, is one case. More broadly, there's often a deep reliance on traditional healers and beliefs about spirits causing illness. This can lead to a shyness or distrust of modern medicine, meaning people delay seeking treatment until it's too late.
One particularly striking point was the unique genetic vulnerability highlighted during COVID-19.
That was a crucial finding. Many tribal populations have a relatively high prevalence of G6PD deficiency. It's a genetic condition affecting red blood cells. In some groups, the prevalence is as high as 27%.
And why was that significant for COVID?
Because hydroxychloroquine, HCQ, a drug widely experimented with early in the pandemic, can cause severe hemolytic anemia in people with G6PD deficiency. So a potential treatment was actually dangerous for a significant portion of these populations. Combine that genetic risk with remote locations, poor healthcare access, and underlying malnutrition, and you see how vulnerable they were.
So we've seen how development is often the source of the problem. Let's loop back to development-induced displacement, the idea of development refugees.
That term, coined by B.D. Sharma, really captures the injustice. People forced from their homes not by war or famine, but by state-sanctioned projects aimed at national progress. The historical examples are staggering. Pongdam, Jamshedpur, Sardar Sarovar, countless mines, displacing millions over decades.
When a community is uprooted like this, what are the cascading effects?
It's a domino effect of loss. First, the loss of productive assets, their land, forests, water sources. Then, forced marginalization in the new resettlement sites, which are often inadequate. Profound culture shock, moving from a familiar, kin-based society to an alien environment.
And social breakdown.
Complete disintegration of family and community systems. L.P. Vidyarthi studied this and coined the term industrial nomadism, displaced tribals forced into a cycle of temporary, low-skilled, often exploitative labor, like working in brick kilns or construction sites, losing all self-sufficiency. They become perpetual nomads in the industrial economy.
For a long time, the law governing land acquisition was heavily biased against those being displaced. What changed?
The big shift came with the Right to Fair Compensation and Transparency in Land Acquisition, Rehabilitation, and Resettlement Act, LAR Act, of 2013. It replaced the old Colonial Era Act of 1894.
What were the key improvements?
2 major things. First, much fairer compensation, mandated at 4 times the market value for rural land acquisition. Second, and perhaps more revolutionary, the requirement for mandatory consent.
How does the consent part work?
For public-private partnership, PPP projects, consent is needed from 70% of affected families. For purely private projects, it's 80%. This theoretically gives communities a real say, a power they never had before. Policy frameworks like the National R&R Policy 2007 and the XAXA Committee also pushed hard for minimizing displacement and ensuring comprehensive rehabilitation, not just cash payouts, a rights-based approach.
This tension between imposed systems and traditional ways also plays out in local governance, right? Introducing modern democracy versus traditional leadership.
Absolutely. The Panchayati Raj extension to scheduled areas, PISA Act of 1996, was intended to empower tribal communities by recognizing their traditional Gram Sabhas, village assemblies. But it also introduced formal elections based on universal adult franchise, creating elected panchayat leaders.
Which inevitably led to clashes.
Often, yes. You had conflict between these new statutory leaders and the traditional chiefs or councils who had held authority for generations. The sources mention this among the Burhors and MP, for example. Two parallel power structures emerge.
But sometimes they found ways to coexist.
Yes, some communities adapted quite pragmatically. Among the Gonds, for instance, a functional split often developed. The elected panchayat leaders would handle government schemes, development funds, and liaising with the state machinery,
While the traditional leaders
retained authority over internal community matters. Social customs, religious practices, resolving local disputes, especially marital ones. It became a kind of division of labor.
and PESA itself, despite the complexities, did give significant powers back to the community level, didn't it?
Definitely. It formally empowered the Gram Sabha. They got powers to manage local resources like minor water bodies, control local money lending, give mandatory prior recommendation for minor mineral leases, and very importantly, ownership over minor forest produce, MFP, like tendu leaves or bamboo. This was a major shift, aiming to restore community control over resources.
When these political and economic tensions aren't managed, they can escalate into ethnicity and unrest. How do the sources frame these ethnic conflicts?
They're often described as being rooted in perceived differences, political, social, economic, religious, but ultimately expressed as a struggle for the group's survival, identity, and control over resources or territory. It's often framed as a deep-seated feeling of alienation or marginalization.
Are there theoretical models to help understand the drivers?
Yes. Anthropologists often use three main models. First, the primordial model. This sees conflict arising from deep, almost innate historical loyalties based on kinship, language, religion. Think of ancient ethnic rivalries. The identity is seen as fixed and fundamental.
Second,
The instrumental model. This perspective argues that ethnicity is often mobilized by leaders as a tool to achieve political power or economic gain. The Farkhad movement is a classic example. Leaders united various tribal groups under a shared Adivasi identity to demand a separate state and control over its rich mineral resources. Identity becomes a means to an end.
and the third model.
The constructivist model. This suggests that ethnic identity isn't fixed or purely instrumental, but is socially and politically constructed, often shaped by external forces like colonial policies or modern state boundaries. Think about how the Belgians solidified distinctions between Hutu and Tutsi in Rwanda based on arbitrary criteria.
And the consequences of this unrest in India.
They range from demands for greater autonomy or even secession, like the ongoing demand for Greater Nagaland, to significant outmigration from conflict zones, loss of livelihoods, and cycles of violence. Addressing the root causes the political and economic grievances is crucial.
So, bringing this all together, what's the unique role anthropology can play, not just in analyzing the problems, but in finding solutions?
Anthropology's strength is its holistic, culturally sensitive approach. Anthropologists like Verrier Elwin famously advocated, along with Nehru, for the Panchsheel doctrine for tribal development,
Which emphasized
development tailored to the genius of the tribes, avoiding imposition of outside values, respecting their culture and integrating them gradually, not forcibly assimilating them.
and in practical policy terms.
Anthropologists can provide crucial context-specific insights for things like resettlement programs, making them more humane and effective. They can help bridge the gap between traditional knowledge systems and modern resource management, for example, through initiatives like the Traditional Knowledge Digital Libraries, TKDL, which document traditional medicine to prevent biopiracy. The goal, from an anthropological perspective, is usually integration with protection, allowing communities to benefit from development without sacrificing their cultural identity.
We have certainly covered a lot of ground in this deep dive. We started with the sheer difficulty of even defining tribe, moving through those early, often problematic physical classifications of Risley and Guha,
to the specific legal categories of scheduled tribes and the extremely vulnerable PVTGs.
and then we confronted the harsh realities, the devastating cycle of land alienation, debt, the health crisis highlighted by things like that G6PD vulnerability, and the fact that nearly half of all people displaced by development in India belong to these communities.
It really lays bare the central conflict, You have policies designed to protect the FRA, PISA, Schedule 56, but they constantly clash with the powerful economic drive for resources, for mining, for dams, for industry. That's a fundamental tension.
The struggle seems to be less about just economics and more about preserving cultural integrity, autonomy, and dignity against these overwhelming pressures. Which leads us perfectly into our final provocative thought for you, the listener.
Right. Our sources touched upon two interesting related phenomena. First, pseudo-tribalism cases, where individuals from higher castes have fraudulently obtained scheduled tribe certificates to access reservation benefits like jobs or education quotas.
And the flip side.
Retribalization. This is where groups that might have assimilated into the broader Hindu caste structure over time actively reclaim or emphasize their tribal identity, often specifically to gain access to the constitutional protections and economic benefits associated with ST status.
So this brings up a really crucial modern question, something for you to think about. In today's India, where legal identity as a tribe is so directly linked to tangible economic advantages, land rights, quotas, special development funds, does that original anthropological idea of a tribe based on isolation and primitive traits even hold water anymore?
Or has tribal identity itself, in a way, become a kind of political and economic status, something strategically claimed or asserted within the competitive framework of the modern state, perhaps sometimes detached from those older definitions of cultural distinctiveness or isolation?
A complex question with no easy answer, definitely something to keep exploring.
Indeed. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.